You are not who you think you are. You are the expression of the structures you live inside, the patterns you repeat, and the environments that shape you long before you ever realize they're doing anything at all. Most people never see this. They assume identity is something they choose, something they declare, or something they can force into existence through motivation or willpower. But identity doesn't come from intention. It comes from structure. It comes from the systems that guide your days, the rhythms that carry you forward, and the conditions that define what feels possible and what never even enters your awareness. If you look closely at your life, you'll notice something important. The space you wake up in each morning, the routines you fall into without effort, and the inputs that reach you before you've had a chance to filter them are not passive. They are active forces. They shape how you think, how you feel, and how you behave, whether you acknowledge them or not. The structure around you is constantly training you. It trains your attention, your reactions, your expectations, and your sense of what is normal. And because this training happens quietly, you rarely notice it until the results are already visible in your behavior. This is why two people with similar goals can end up with completely different outcomes. One person lives inside a structure that supports clarity, consistency, and stability, and their identity reflects that stability. The other lives inside a structure that fragments their attention, disrupts their routines, and destabilizes their internal rhythm, and their identity reflects that instability. The difference isn't character, it's architecture. A person living in a scattered environment will feel scattered. Someone surrounded by noise will struggle to focus. A life without structure will drift, not because the individual is weak, but because the system they're operating inside doesn't support alignment. When the architecture is misaligned, the identity built on top of it becomes unstable. Confidence becomes inconsistent, discipline becomes fragile, and progress becomes unpredictable. Not because the person is flawed, but because the foundation beneath them is fragmented. In substrate terms, the structure precedes the story. The substrate defines the system defines the behavior, and the behavior defines the identity. Identity is not the starting point. It is the final expression of everything underneath it. This is why so many attempts at self-change collapse. People try to change from the top down. They try to think their way into a new identity, feel different, or force themselves into new behaviors. They focus on mindset, motivation, and willpower, while the structure that produces their current identity remains untouched. But identity doesn't respond to force. It responds to conditions. It responds to the architecture that surrounds it and the systems that run beneath it. If the environment is chaotic, the mind will mirror that chaos. If the routines are unstable, the patterns will be unstable. If the inputs are low quality, the thinking will be low quality. If the constraints are weak, the discipline will be weak. The system is not reacting to you. You are reacting to the system. Shift the conditions, and the identity shifts with them. Change the environment and behavior follows. Change the routines and patterns stabilize. Change the inputs and thinking evolves. Change the constraints and discipline strengthens. When the substrate changes, the identity built on top of it has no choice but to change as well. Most people never make this shift. They try to change the story without changing the structure. They try to change the outcome without changing the conditions. They try to change the identity without changing the system that produces it. They blame themselves for inconsistency, for lack of discipline, for not being able to stay on track, while living inside an architecture that makes consistency nearly impossible. The system is misaligned with the identity they are trying to build, and the system always wins. Once you see this, the problem stops being moral and starts being mechanical. It's no longer about whether you are strong enough, motivated enough, or disciplined enough. It becomes a question of design. What kind of environment would make the behaviors you want feel natural? What kind of routines would make your days predictable enough for progress to compound? What kind of inputs would make clear thinking the default instead of the exception? What kind of constraints would make the wrong choices harder to access and the right choices easier to repeat? This is the shift most people never make. They keep trying to change themselves through effort, through intensity, through temporary bursts of motivation, while the architecture around them pulls them back into the same loops. But when you change the structure, you change the system. When you change the system, you change the behavior. And when the behavior changes consistently, the identity that emerges from it is different. Not because you forced it, but because the conditions made it inevitable. Think about how many times you've tried to improve your life while the underlying structure stayed exactly the same. You weren't failing because you lacked discipline or because your intentions weren't strong enough. You were operating inside an environment that kept pulling you back into the same patterns. When the architecture beneath you is unstable, every attempt at change becomes temporary. The system resets you, the conditions override you. The structure quietly dictates the range of behaviors that feel possible, and anything outside that range becomes a short-lived exception instead of a sustainable pattern. When you shift the architecture, everything else shifts with it. A stable environment creates stable behavior. Clear routines create predictable momentum. High-quality inputs create high-quality thinking. Strong constraints create strong discipline. And when these elements align, the identity that forms on top of them feels natural instead of forced. You don't have to push yourself into it. You grow into it because the structure makes that growth the path of least resistance. This is why substrate dynamics matters. It gives you a way to understand yourself without judgment and a way to change yourself without force. It shows you that you are not separate from the systems you live inside. You are shaped by them, influenced by them, and entangled with them. The structure you live inside, the patterns you repeat, and the conditions you move through shape far more of your identity than intention ever will. And once you understand this, you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What in this structure makes this outcome inevitable?" You don't need to fight yourself. You don't need to force motivation. You don't need to become someone else through effort alone. You need to build the structure that makes the version of you you're trying to reach inevitable. When the architecture is right, the identity emerges naturally. When the systems align, the behavior aligns. When the environment supports you, the mind stabilizes. When the substrate is solid, the person built on top of it becomes solid too. You are not who you think you are. You are what your structure allows you to be. And the moment you take control of that structure, you take control of everything built on top of it. If you want to change who you are, don't start with the mind. Start with the substrate. Change the architecture, and the identity will follow.